Tonight at the library, the wind is howling and shaking the windows, and I wonder what it'd be like to be out there right now, in the wind and the cold. And I'm thinking about Charlie Jones, who was kicked to the curb, kicked out into the cold in 1880 because he asked for $378 that was owed to him. In 1880, Charlie Jones was a ball player for the Boston Red Caps, and he refused to keep playing until Boston paid him $378 in back pay. Historical records would prove Jones correct, but instead of paying him what was rightfully his, Boston fined Jones for refusing to play. Then they suspended him, and then they kicked him off the team. And remember, the reserve clause came about in 1879, the year before, which said players could not go to another team unless their current team approved. So, in addition to losing his job as a professional ball player, Charlie Jones was also blacklisted. He couldn't play on any other team, and he didn't play professional baseball for 3 years until a new league was formed that didn't recognize the reserve clause. Because of the reserve clause that prevented players from leaving their team or negotiating, what happened to Charlie Jones happened to other players, or it kept players in a perpetual state of fear and fury. It got so bad that players decided to form their own league. Now, just think about what kind of effort it would take to form an entire professional baseball league. To me, it's unbelievably daunting just to consider. You're not forming a team in a league, you're forming an entire professional league. Think about the organization, the funding for new stadiums and resources, the marketing to draw in fans who are already used to other leagues. There are thousands of things to consider, but it shows you how bad things were to consider doing something so daunting just to get out from under the reserve clause. Starting in 1885, John Montgomery Ward, one of the premier players of the day and also a lawyer, worked with investors and other players for 5 years to form the Players League in 1890. One of the main differences in this league was a profit sharing model for players. But there were many problems with the league, including constant efforts by the National League owners to undercut and sabotage, to slash ticket prices, as one example, so that the Players League couldn't compete. And it worked. The Players League folded the next year. But just to give you some perspective on how badly players wanted to play in a league with more rights and better conditions, I want to mention this book. It was written in 2005 by David Pietrusa, and it's titled Major Leagues: The Formation, Sometimes Absorption, and Mostly Inevitable Demises of 18 Professional Baseball Organizations, 1871 to present. 18 leagues. And many of these leagues were created as a healthier alternative to the National League and later the American League. But outside of the American League, every one of these other leagues failed. And as another fun note, one of the advocates for the Players League in 1890, and he was a player manager at the time, was none other than Charles Comiskey. That's right. Ebenezer Scrooge pops up again in our story, but this is a much younger, much more liberal Scrooge. At the time in 1890, Charles Comiskey jumped from the American Association to the Players League, which again was a league where profit sharing was the main selling point. This is so interesting, and for me, this example branches into so many thought experiments. Because here you have young Charles Comiskey, decades before he becomes a cold, uber wealthy owner, and he's advocating for, among all things, profit sharing for players. Last episode, I showed that while he wasn't cheap and was very generous compared to the other league owners, Comiskey was still cheap and withholding. I wonder what would happen if the young Comiskey had a conversation with the old Comiskey. Maybe this is a movie idea. Wouldn't it be fun to think about what would have happened if Comiskey met his younger self and then came back to this belief about profit sharing? What would have happened in, say, 1910 or after World War I in 1919 if Comiskey, an already powerful owner, tells his players, hey, you're all able to participate in profit sharing? What happens then? If he's allowed to do this and the players get a taste of profit sharing and more of the overall cut, how could they ever go back? Once they experience profit sharing, and once other players on other teams see this reality, how could it not have a domino effect? Baseball as we know it today would look completely different. But of course, that didn't happen. And this is all to say, players were desperate and persistently trying to get out from under the reserve clause and other restrictive regulations. But it's pretty hard to unite for a common cause when you can't even work together to win a game. The 1919 Chicago White Sox had to use every ounce of restraint to do this, to work together to win games. And as we know, by the time of the World Series, they couldn't even do that. Tonight, the massive dysfunction of the 1919 White Sox and how the story of one bitter, wronged player may have caused 7 other careers to come to a screeching halt. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball. Tonight, Part 2, The Greatest Myth in Baseball History.
Watergate might have equaled the level of impact on the American public that the Black Sox scandal did. As a visceral impact on the American public, the World Series scandal was bigger.
Up next. This idea of a dysfunctional, conflict ridden team that learns to live and play together, it's nothing new. I mean, take your pick from Hollywood. Bad News Bears, Hoosiers, Remember the Titans, Major League. These are all stories of inner turmoil and big personalities who can't get along. But when we stick to reality, the 1919 White Sox were as dysfunctional as any of these fictional examples. When you peel back a few layers from the 1919 White Sox, you can quickly see the factions, the hatred some players felt toward others. But no hatred was stronger than what Charles Arnold Gandil, known as Chick, felt toward second baseman and teammate Eddie Collins. It was so bad, this would have been like a soap opera level of loathing and hatred, and there are a lot of reasons for it. Eddie Collins was an Ivy League graduate, and his education and upbringing made him stand out wherever he played. Author Paul Minnermeyer gives a colorful profile of Collins. He writes, quote, Collins was one of the smartest players of his day, and he knew it. Saddled with the nickname Cocky from early in his career, Collins drew the resentment of teammates for his self-confidence and good breeding that at times seemed as though it belonged more in a ballroom than a baseball clubhouse. End quote. As I already mentioned, Collins was the highest paid second baseman in 1919 with a salary of $15,000. And after Ty Cobb, Collins was the highest paid player in the entire league. He was also the team captain. Chick Gandil, meanwhile, earned only $4,000, nearly 4 times less than Collins. Now, I say only $4,000, but only 3 other first basemen in the majors made more money than Gandil. And 2 of them have fantastic names. Wally Pipp, who eventually lost his starting role to Lou Gehrig, and Stuffy McGinnis. Still, Chick Gandil was bitter toward Comiskey for not paying him more, and he saw Collins as Comiskey's pet. So for Gandil, who was thought to be the ringleader of the whole gambling scandal, there was already plenty of hate to fuel his motives. But there's another deeper seed for Chick Gandil's hatred of Eddie Collins. For all of Collins's Ivy League grace, he was known as a brute on the field, delivering devastating tags at second base. From a biographical standpoint, Collins is an interesting character. Remember, Paul Mittermeier just described a man whose mannerisms and breeding belonged more in a ballroom than a baseball field. And at the same time, we have this guy who turns second base into a boxing ring. And off the field, he's rubbing his education and high opinion of himself in people's faces. If you have even the slightest grievance, somebody like Eddie Collins is going to pour salt all over your wounds. But back to this point about hard tags. I talked about this in a previous episode, and it's something you definitely would miss as a fan watching the game. For players running to first or second or third, hard tags were like hammers to the head. Infielders knew exactly how to slam the glove down with the part of the leather holding the ball. In his book, The Baseball Codes Beanballs, Sign Stealing, and Bench Clearing Brawls, author Jason Turbo describes a number of firsthand accounts of being on the receiving end of a hard tag. From player turned manager Dusty Baker, quote, Willie Stargell would slap you so nicely, he'd smile, then drop that hammer on your head, on your ribs. It makes you shorten your lead. Oh boy, that would hurt. End quote. And from another player turned manager, Dave Roberts, quote, Randall Simon and Carlos Delgado just beat you up. That's just what they do. It's why I try not to stay at first base for too long. End quote. And from Turbo himself, quote, Willie McCovey delivered among the hardest blows in the business, inspiring Lou Brock to claim that leading off against the Giants was the worst experience one could have. End quote. Players could get all kinds of injuries, concussions from these tags. And in 1912, 7 years before the White Sox scandal, this is the kind of thing that happened between Eddie Collins and Chick Gandil. Again, from Paul Mittermeier, quote, An unflinching tag by Eddie Collins broke the nose of Washington first baseman Chick Gandil. Chick's teammate Clyde Milan witnessed the play and noted, and this is from Milan, quote, For the rest of his playing career, Gandil was out to get even. He went into the bag against Collins 200 times, I guess, and always got the worst of it. End quote. This description makes me think of Charlie Brown running up to kick the football, and each time Lucy pulls it away at the last minute. Except every time Chick Gandil slides into second base, he's out for revenge. He's out for blood. He's trying his damnedest to take down Eddie Collins, to actually physically harm Collins. But every time, Collins gets the best of him. Every time, Collins, with his ballroom grace, dances out of the way of a charging, sliding Gandil and still manages to deliver a devastating blow with his glove. What's that going to do to your state of mind over the course of 7 years? Knowing your nemesis, the guy who's literally beaten you 200 times, is also the second highest paid player in the league, is also the team captain, is also a favorite of the owner, and he's an elitist snob. Eddie Collins later talked about the state of this dysfunctional 1919 team. He said, quote, In 1919, we were a club that pulled apart rather than together. There were frequent arguments and open hostility. All the things you're taught to believe are vital to the success of an athletic organization were missing from ours. And yet, it was the greatest collection of players ever assembled, I would say. End quote. According to Collins, the White Sox had all the makings of a dynasty or one of those great sports films, except that's not going to happen. By 1919, when the two men are teammates, Chick Gandil is a ball of rage. He's a good first baseman, a good hitter, known for a solid work ethic. But he looks around and sees many of his teammates making much more money than him. And Eddie Collins, that elitist snob, is making nearly 4 times as much. And of course, Charles Comiskey wants to win the World Series. Eddie Collins wants to win the World Series. How sweet would it be if Chick Gandil could score a big payday and stick it to who he would have seen as elitist sons of bitches? What could be better? If there's a villain in this story, it seems to be Chick Gandil. As the ringleader and go-between for the gamblers and players, it was Gandil's job to dole out the cuts. But did he actually give his teammates their cuts? Years later, Gandil professed that he never got a dime. But author Daniel Ginsburg has a different take. Ginsburg wrote, quote, Gandil may have been the only banished player who gained more than he lost in the fix. After the 1919 World Series, the first baseman retired from Major League Baseball, reportedly taking $35,000 in cash with him. End quote. And here Ginsburg is referring to $35,000 of game fixing money, money that was supposed to be given to other players. $35,000 in 1919 is equivalent to nearly $700,000 today. And to clarify the timeline for a moment, an entire season went by, 1920, before any public outcry and trial. So after the World Series, Chick Gandil demanded to be paid $10,000 for his new 1920 contract. When Comiskey refused, Gandil and his wife retired to California. So he ended up maybe retiring with $700,000 in his pocket before anything came out about the fix, before the trial ever happened. To me, this is a great example of it only taking one man with a cauldron of hatred and bitterness fueling his actions, and not a care in the world whether he succeeds or fails, because he was already on his way out. He was already leaning toward California and retirement. I'd love to talk with Chick Gandil. I'd love to ask him how he felt when they lost the series, when he looked into the eyes of Eddie Collins and the other men he despised. Was it satisfying? Did it scratch the itch of revenge? Or did it leave him empty, even more detached, even more hollowed out than before? Now, with all I said, it's still possible that Gandil was someone else. In 1956, he wrote an article for Sports Illustrated. He would have been an old man at this point. And in the article, he basically says, yeah, we tried to fix the World Series. We deserved to be kicked out. But actually, in the end, we didn't try to tank the series. We tried to win. In the end, we lost to the Reds fair and square. Now, at this point, it's hard to believe anything Chick Gandil says. Because also in this Sports Illustrated article, he said he never received a dime from the fix, which is strange because he was one of the ringleaders, and other players who were more on the periphery, who were barely involved, like Lefty Williams and Joe Jackson, definitely received money, at least $5,000. Now, even without Gandil, the fix still might have happened, as knuckleball pitcher Eddie Cicotte was supposedly the second ringleader. But there were more members of this faction. In an article on Sabre, Bill Lamb broke down the divisions. Quote, one clique was headed by team captain Eddie Collins, Ivy League educated and self assured to the point of arrogance. Aligned with cocky Collins were catcher Ray Schalk, spitballer Red Faber, and outfielders Shane Collins and Nemo Leibold. The other faction, a more hard-scrabble group united in envy, if not outright hatred of the socially superior Collins, was headed by tough guy Gandil and the more amiable Cicotte. Also in their corner were Buck Weaver, shortstop Swede Risberg, outfielder Happy Felsch, and utility man Fred McMullen. End quote. Notice right here you have 6 of the 8 men out in this second faction. Missing are Shoeless Joe Jackson and Lefty Williams, but we'll get to them. This all makes sense for Chick Gandil with his quote-unquote low salary and his years of resentment. But why Eddie Cicotte? With bonuses, Cicotte earned $15,000 for the 1918 and 1919 seasons. According to writer Bob Hoey, the only major league pitcher to make more money in that time was Walter Johnson, one of the greatest pitchers ever. Compared to other players, Eddie Cicotte was making bank. But Cicotte had a lot of mouths to feed. According to writer Jim Sandoval, in the book Scandal on the South Side, Cicotte was responsible for a household of 12 people, and he'd recently purchased a large farm in Michigan. So for Cicotte, he might have felt like he needed the fixed money. But again, he stood to gain more than $5,000 from winning the series, which was pretty much seen as a lock for the uber talented White Sox team. But this is where we come back to one of the key answers we already discussed. Why did Eddie Cicotte take this big risk? Because in his mind, it was no risk at all. In 1919, the winning players would get $5,000 each, but the losers would receive $3,200. So there was a decent payout for losing, and for Cicotte and Gandil, they'd get thousands more from the fix. Even if this is true, even if game fixing at the time was seen by players as stealing office supplies, it must have been hard if they'd never done it before, or not to this degree. Think about the physical, mental, and emotional composition of a Major League Baseball player. For years and years, it's all about training, pushing, tweaking every part of your being toward this one irrefutable goal: to win, to triumph, and to try your hardest doing it, and to help your teammates in the process, to strive towards something together. Even if your mind is saying one thing, your body still wants to win. All the muscle memory aches to win. And for a pitcher, this seems even more of an inner battle because every pitch is a tiny little tear in the athlete's soul. Every throw from a pitcher is working toward a strikeout, toward seeing the defeat of the hitter and knowing you won another battle. Going against this well ingrained pattern could break you. It could make you sick. And apparently, this is what happened to Eddie Cicotte. In front of the grand jury a year later, Cicotte said that he was sick all night after throwing that first game, and he told teammate Happy Felsch he wouldn't do it again. From Cicotte, quote, "I didn't care whether I got shot out there the next minute. I was going to win the ball game and the series." End quote. This comment from Cicotte does a couple of things, and one of those things is that it highlights the danger these men were in. He said, "I didn't care if I got shot out there." Throughout this whole story, there are rumors of death threats or acts of physical violence from the gamblers, the mobsters. These are some nasty characters. So the players very well could have feared for their safety. And this is not to condone their choices, only to see how hard it might have been to climb out of the holes they dug for themselves. To first plan on throwing the World Series, then to change their minds and to decide to win. That's what Cicotte said happened. Even in the face of danger, he was going to try to win. And this account mirrored what Chick Gandil later said. What started as a fix turned into a sincere effort to win, but too late. Now, whether they were truthful or lying about trying to win in the end, they didn't. In the best of 9 series, the White Sox lost to the Reds in 8 games. If you think this show's worth $1, please donate at the website midnightlibraryofbaseball.com or through Podbean. You can also leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. Okay, back to the show. So for a while, nothing happened. Nobody says anything. Then during the 1920 season, the season after the fix, rumors began to circulate and circulate. And for reasons I'll explain later, American League President Ban Johnson insisted on a criminal trial for the guilty parties, which took place in the summer of 1921. At the end of the trial, the state asked the jury to sentence the 8 men to 5 years in prison and a $2,000 fine. But since no state laws were actually broken, the jury acquitted all 8 men. From author Gene Carney, quote, "The not guilty verdict was greeted with wild enthusiasm by the players, who were quick to congratulate each other and the jury, while shouting to the reporters over the cheering crowd." End quote. But think of what must have been going through the minds of these 8 men. They undertook this fix with not a care in the world of getting caught and punished, because over the last 16 years, nobody had been punished at all. And suddenly they were facing 5 years of jail time and a substantial fine. Talk about having the rug pulled out from under you. And even though they were acquitted in a court of law, their celebrations were short lived. Again from Carney, quote, "After the trial, the players celebrated at a local restaurant into the wee hours. But when they awoke, Judge Landis's verdict, the one that counted more, had come down. All players charged were banished." End quote. Now, what's going on here? They were acquitted, but then found guilty? Well, there was a criminal trial which was outside of Major League Baseball. But then there was the new commissioner of baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the all powerful decision maker inside Major League Baseball. And it's worth getting into here how the National Commission, a governing body of men, suddenly turns into one man with all the control. By 1920, the National Commission was in shambles. Many of the league's owners hated it. And considering the recent cases and all the problems, most owners wanted a change. When I talked to Charles Fountain, author of The Betrayal, the 1919 World Series, and the Birth of Modern Baseball, he discussed this kind of no win situation that the owners found themselves in.
The man they decided on was a Chicago federal judge by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Everyone now knows Judge Landis as the first commissioner of baseball. And as a condition of his appointment, he demanded absolute authority.
So, after 16 years of wavering, of turning a blind eye, we now have a governing body in the form of Kennesaw Mountain Landis who was swinging a hammer and nobody could stop him. Remember W.H. Locke, the Pittsburgh Pirates secretary, who predicted in 1903 that the cost of the National Commission's inaction would be high? Well, here it is, the cost in 1920, embodied in this take no prisoners mindset of Landis. For nearly 2 decades, the National Commission and Major League Baseball turned a blind eye. They didn't take accountability for what was happening. And now, to get out of the mess they created, they ceded all power and control to one man. When you see photos of Kennesaw Mountain Landis, he looks how you might think he'd look. He's old and gaunt, almost haunting, always dressed in a dark suit, his white hair somehow combed and a mess at the same time. And the way he stares at the camera, you'd think he never smiled a day in his life. He's absolutely serious. In the summer of 1921, Landis was set on cleaning house. He wanted to rid baseball of even the slightest whiff of corruption, at least when it came to game fixing. And the 8 men on trial were the object lesson. In forestry terms, you can kind of see this action as a controlled burn. Landis didn't care about burning down part of the forest as long as he had control, and it would prevent 100,000 acres from going up in a future blaze. And really, the owners came out looking pretty clean. Not Comiskey necessarily, but part of the root of this problem is the reserve clause and the owners not paying players what they could have paid them. And this system with the reserve clause continued on for more than 50 years. But this brings us to another great myth of this story, that this trial, that the outing of 8 White Sox players was inevitable. People might think a scandal of this magnitude could only hide in the darkness for so long, that it was bound to come out. The truth is that White Sox owner Charles Comiskey, former advocate for player profit sharing, former outspoken enemy of game fixing, tried his damnedest to cover his ears and make the scandal go away. If not for a deep personal feud between Comiskey and American League president Ban Johnson, there probably would have been no trial, no banishment. If not for the scarred personal history between these two proud, stubborn men, Shoeless Joe Jackson could have been one of the first players inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. From Jacob Pomeranke, editor of Scandal on the South Side.
There was a big feud between Comiskey and the American League president Ban Johnson, and Ban Johnson was the one that really spearheaded the investigation in the summer of 1920 and helped get the grand jury formed in Chicago to investigate corruption. And so yeah, if not for that, it's possible they would have swept it under the rug just like they did with many other scandals before 1919. And we'd still be talking about it as a what if.
Various sources, including a memoir by sports writer Hugh Fullerton, state that Comiskey knew about the fix even before the World Series began. According to Chick Gandil in his Sports Illustrated article, a lot of people knew about the fix before the series began. From Gandil, quote, By the time we arrived in Cincinnati to open the series, the rumors were really flying. Even a clerk in a stationery store, not recognizing me as a ball player, told me confidentially, "I have it firsthand that the series is in the bag." Waitresses and bellhops were talking the same way. Reporters were buzzing about, asking questions. End quote. And I brought up this point with Charles Fountain. For Charles Comiskey, discovering that his team, or at least some players on his team, were planning to take a dive, that would have been crushing. Here's this former player turned manager turned owner who put so much into building a winning team. In a lot of ways, Comiskey did more than any other team owner in the league, ever. From writer Irv Goldfarb, quote, by the time of its opening on July 1st, 1910, the cost of Comiskey Park and its grounds totaled $750,000, a remarkable amount for the time. Additional seating in subsequent seasons raised the cost to over $1 million. Tommy was the only owner at this time to own his entire club, the grounds, and all the equipment. End quote. And to further create a winning ball club, Comiskey invested heavily. He paid Philadelphia $50,000 for Eddie Collins' contract. He paid the Cleveland Indians $31,500 for Joe Jackson's contract. Comiskey not only wanted a winning team, he wanted a dynasty. And in the fall of 1919, he was on the brink of achieving this goal when suddenly he's hearing these rumors that his players are going to crush his dreams. But again, according to Charles Fountain, the fallout of such a scandal would have ruined baseball, and it would have been worse for Comiskey than going public and trying to stop it. The thing is, when Comiskey couldn't cover it up anymore, he changed course, and he took on the face of the wounded, outraged owner. He went public as the diehard crusader searching only for the truth. From Irv Goldfarb, quote, Comiskey responded by publicly offering $20,000 to anyone with knowledge of the fix. When St. Louis Browns infielder Joe Gideon did come forward with information, Comiskey rebuffed him and never paid the reward. End quote. And there's a mountain of evidence to show that Comiskey wanted badly to sweep the scandal under the rug. And some of the best evidence appears in the contracts Comiskey extended to the Fixers for the 1920 season. Again, at this point, after the 1919 World Series, Comiskey definitely knew about the fix and knew of some, if not all, the players involved. And yet, for the 1920 season and 2 years after, he increased Joe Jackson's salary to $8,000 per year. He gave Lefty Williams a $6,000 contract with bonuses of $1,500. And Eddie Seacott, one of the ringleaders, signed a new 1-year contract in 1920 for $10,000. Why would you award these ample salaries to players you were planning to publicly out? Unless you weren't. So Charles Comiskey knew and tried to cover it up. But why couldn't he? All of the previous game fixing scandals were swept under the rug. Well, in 1919, his once good friend, American League President Ban Johnson, was now a mortal enemy. The two men hated each other. From Irv Goldfarb, quote, during the course of the dead ball era, Comiskey's amicable relationship with Ban Johnson disintegrated into open warfare. According to legend, the discord erupted in 1905 when Johnson sent Comiskey a load of fresh fish on the same day that he suspended outfielder Ducky Holmes for an altercation with an umpire the previous day. Comiskey was irate. End quote. What I picture is Charles Comiskey walking into his office, learning that one of his players is suspended, which hurts his team, and then he starts to smell something foul. He follows the rank odor to his desk where he finds a pile of dead fish. That lingering smell would certainly be enough to create a mortal enemy, I think. And from here, the animosity grew until it reached a tipping point in 1919 with an incident involving Red Sox pitcher Carl Mays. You may remember Carl Mays from a previous episode because Mays, while playing with the Yankees, is the only pitcher to ever cause a fatality in Major League history when he beamed and killed Ray Chapman. But in 1919, Mays was a disgruntled Red Sox who left the team without permission and then demanded a trade. American League president Ban Johnson ordered a suspension, but Red Sox manager Harry Frazee ignored Johnson and traded Mays to the Yankees. The Yankees owners and Charles Comiskey sided with Frazee, while the rest of the league sided with Ban Johnson. This was the last straw for Comiskey and Johnson. And while all this was unfolding, so was the Black Sox scandal. By the time the rumors about the World Series fix gained enough traction, Ban Johnson was a stick of dynamite. He was just waiting for a way to take down Comiskey. And when he heard about the fix, he would have been delighted. I can see him rubbing his hands and laughing maniacally, because time after time, Johnson had ignored cases of game fixing. And now, suddenly, he's a crusader? It was a perfect storm. You have Ban Johnson's building fury toward Charles Comiskey. You have the league owners fed up with the National Commission and craving anyone who could put things right, leading to Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the new dictator of baseball. From writer Dan Busby, quote, when the owners traveled to Chicago to meet with Landis, he laid down terms that were hard. The owners of ball clubs must yield all their rights, even the right to think. The baseball magnates were stricken with panic that the public would desert them or their turnstiles, and were willing to agree to anything and everything. They offered Landis a 7-year contract with a salary of $50,000, which was much more than the top players made. End quote. It sure was. The highest player salary in 1920 was $20,000, and Landis was making more than double. For the impact of Landis's unprecedented ruling in 1921, here's Charles Fountain.
Judge Landis the next morning announced in a release that has become quite famous in its language, regardless of the verdicts of juries, he said, no player who has ever fixed a game nor taken part in conversation where the main ways and means of fixing a baseball game were discussed and did not report it shall ever play baseball again. And the 8 players, regardless of their acquittal of criminal charges, were effectively banned. So what this did, and we're moving along very quickly here, but what this did was quiet the disquiet that had grown once the story of Black Sox scandal broke. When the players confessed in August of 1920 that they had been complicit in fixing the 1919 World Series. All of a sudden, America lost its faith in the game of baseball. And there was nothing like Americans' faith in the game of baseball then. They were really of the belief that even though there had been stories of gambling, there had been suspensions of players, there had been rumors of gambling, nobody wanted to believe it. But now, not only did were they forced to believe that the 19 World Series had been compromised, but all of those rumors that they had heard in the years leading up to that, in really the 2 decades of organized baseball, and in the several decades of the professional baseball before the advent of what we know as the major leagues, the American and National League in 1903. All of that was now suddenly called into question. So the game that the Americans had embraced and identified with for decades was now under a huge cloud. And what Landis's decision in banning those 8 players in 1921 allowed the public, and by public, not only fans, but the newspaper writers that wrote about baseball, to move on, to say all of that has now been taken care of. And baseball is once again pure, and you may give it your love, as America has done for the better part of a century and more since. And particularly so in the decades of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when baseball was the American common denominator when it came to professional sport.
And Bill Lamb, author of Black Sox in the Courtroom, also has a take on the palpable impact of Judge Landis's decision.
What you have to understand is this: baseball's reputation was at stake, and Landis was engaged as commissioner to basically to make sure that it was not further tarnished. If nothing else, the goal of deterrence was established by the banishment, particularly the banishment of Buck Weaver. If you accept the proposition, and I don't, of course, that Weaver was nothing more than a person who had knowledge that the fix was ongoing, his banishment sent a clear message. If you know about corruption and do not bring it to the attention of your superiors, your manager, your club owners, you too are exposed to the penalty of permanent expulsion. And that clearly had a chilling effect upon future scandals. While there were a couple that followed, uh, and Landis banished several other players in the aftermath of the scandal, by 1925, game fixing had really disappeared from the major league landscape. You cannot find, or I am not aware, I should say, of a single game fixing incident at the major league level since 1924. And that is because, in my opinion, the deterrent effect generated by the Landis expulsion of the Black Sox.
And this takes us all the way back to the power and impact of baseball in 1919. Again, from Charles Fountain.
I think as you look back on it now, that for me, the ultimate lesson and the ultimate takeaway is how important the game of baseball was to America and the American people in the 1920s. That there has been no scandal in sport and few scandals in American history that has so rocked the soul of America as the 1919 World Series scandal. And that to me is the sort of bottom line takeaway, is that football's important now. Football's big now. Baseball is still big. The NBA is still big. College football and basketball are very big. But were any scandal to flower in any of those games now, I suspect that it would elicit more of a shrug than a shock from the American public.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because baseball and boxing, they were the two premier sports of the time, but
Mhm.
baseball more overall. So it's hard to envision what it would have felt like for people. And also entertainment. We have so many more forms of entertainment today, whereas in the 1910s, it's sports and
Mhm.
politics, and it's very limited. So that world, it would have been so important. I wonder if there is a comparison for today. Maybe politics?
I can't think of one. Watergate might have equaled the level of impact on the American public that the Black Sox scandal did. And you compare the two, one threatened the game of baseball, the other threatened the Constitution and the democracy that we've
Yeah.
got. And I think you could argue that is as a visceral impact on the American public, the World Series scandal is bigger.
When you step back and look at the biggest losers in this whole affair, Charles Comiskey is certainly on the list. From a personal standpoint, Comiskey changed after the scandal. According to author Tim Hornbaker in his Comiskey biography, quote, "The 1919 World Series turned his fun-loving personality into utter bitterness. His charming qualities gave way to unrelenting stubbornness, and his rigid personal code and narrow perspective turned longtime friends into resentful enemies. The Black Sox scandal terrorized him at the core, destroying his spirit and capping a nightmare scenario that no baseball leader could ever live down." End quote. The myth was that Charles Comiskey was a villain. The truth is that he was a human of the time, of the position as an owner. I was listening to Hardcore History, probably my favorite podcast, and Dan Carlin was talking about General Douglas MacArthur. And this journalist who met MacArthur and a bunch of other generals and politicians said that they were all of the same type. No matter where you go, no matter the religion or the culture, people in these positions, the journalist said, are all of the same type. And Dan Carlin was wondering, is it the type of person who strives for the position, Or is it the position that changes the person? We can ask the same question here with Charles Comiskey, because at one point in his life, in the late 1800s, Comiskey was in a position of power. He was a player manager, and he chose to leave behind a comfortable position of power to take part in a new league that advocated for profit sharing among the players. He was a player. He knew what it was like to be a player. He knew exactly how it felt. But for one reason or another, as he grew older, as he turned into an owner, he lost touch with that part of himself. He treated his human ball players as commodities. All of the owners treated their players as commodities, but Charles Comiskey suffered most from his behavior. He toiled tirelessly to win over the fans and the press, and yet he ignored his players. If he had shifted 2%, 3% of his efforts toward understanding his players, toward building a relationship of, if not like, then at least mutual respect, who knows what might have happened or what might not have happened. In his book, It Ain't So, A Might Have Been History of the White Sox in 1919 and Beyond, author Michael T. Lynch makes this argument. From Lynch, quote, "The White Sox were considered one of the best teams ever assembled, and Ed Barrow insisted they were indeed the best. They had three future Hall of Famers in second baseman Eddie Collins, pitcher Red Faber, and catcher Ray Schalk. And it can be argued that, at the very least, Jackson and pitcher Eddie Seacott were borderline Hall of Famers, who more than likely would have been elected had they enjoyed a few more productive seasons. Center fielder Happy Felsch, third baseman Buck Weaver, and pitcher Lefty Williams had MVP caliber talent and perhaps outside shots at a Hall of Fame berth as well." End quote. Lynch went on to say, quote, "If not for the suspension of 6 of their best players, the White Sox would likely have competed with the Yankees for American League pennants from 1921 through 1923, and perhaps beyond." End quote. Now, sure, this is alternative history, but did you take that in? It's possible, if not likely, that if not for the scandal, we'd today be talking about the dominant White Sox of the 1920s. And here's the thing that blows my mind. It's possible that 8 players on this 1919 White Sox team could have been in the Hall of Fame. 8 players. That's insane. Now, this isn't to say there weren't other teams in history with stacked lineups of Hall of Famers. Mostly the New York Yankees of 1927, 1928. I mean, you can go to 1933, and the 1928 Philadelphia Athletics. But the 1919 White Sox could have been in this company. And really, there could have been 9 total Hall of Famers because we're leaving out one person who did get into the Hall of Fame who was a member of the 1919 team, and that's Charles Comiskey. Even though Charles Comiskey continued to pay a premium for star players, he would never again assemble a championship team, and it would be 4 decades until the White Sox reached another World Series in 1959. I wonder if afterwards, and in the last years of his life, Charles Comiskey ever tallied up the numbers and thought about how much he could have paid his players to avoid game fixing, or how much money it would have been worth to him to not only avoid the scandal, but to let his players try from the beginning in that 1919 World Series and beyond. Or if he ever thought, if I was a little bit kinder, if I paid a little bit more attention, what might have happened. In 1931, 10 years after Kennesaw Mountain Landis' decision to ban 8 players for life, Charles Comiskey died at the age of 72. In episode 3, we'll finish this 3-part series with the story, true and false, of the legendary figure who has become larger than life, but who still can't find redemption after death.
Shoeless Joe is almost a folk hero at this point. He's such an iconic character in American culture, American society. There are parts of his story that you cannot deny. I mean, he was one of the greatest hitters in baseball history. He did hit well in the World Series. There are aspects of his education, that were not what we would consider today to be, very well educated. But that does not mean that he was not a smart man. He was a very shrewd businessman, very successful businessman, and knew what he was doing, and certainly knew what he was getting into with the Black Sox scandal.
Next time on the Midnight Library of Baseball. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Special thanks to Bill Lamb, Charles Fountain, and Jacob Pomerinke. Music by Sergi Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.